Okay, we are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. We are convening a hearing to actually just do a kind of a background walkthrough of a bill we passed a couple of years ago, Act 59, the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. We are in receipt of the first deliverable from the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, the inventory report, and the VHCB is in the process. They have hired a consultant to do phase 2, which is a planning process. So we will be inviting them in very soon to hear about both the inventory report and their planning process. But I thought it would be helpful to the committee to get the background on the statute from our legislative council in preparation for that information. Welcome back, Ellen Tchaikovsky.
Thank you. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Today, posted on your website, I did have the inventory report posted, and then also the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through. I don't normally do a PowerPoint, but I'm going to today because we're just going to review. We're going to go over the statute, and maybe a little more colorful presentation would look nice. Do you want me to share my screens as we go through the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. So I'll be talking about Act 59 of 2023, which was the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. Annika, can you let me share my screen? It's not working. Yeah. So this law is also known as the 30 by 30 or 50 by 50. And so it establishes in statutes goals for the state on land conservation. There it goes. Okay, thank you. So it establishes goals for the state of Vermont to conserve 30% of its land area by 2030 and 50% of its land area by 2050. And it does this by requiring the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, as the chair just mentioned, to work with the Agency of Natural Resources to first take inventory of what land is already conserved in the state, and then develop a plan on how to achieve the rest of the percentage so that the 30% of land can be conserved. So as far as, that's pretty readable, as far as the statutory language, first there is a definition section, and there are 6 definitions in the statute. The first 3 are conservation categories that are used in this bill. And so these are all describing areas of land that have been conserved, and they have different levels of protection on them. So the first category is ecological reserve area. It means an area having permanent protection from conversion and that is managed to maintain a natural state within which ecological processes and disturbance events are allowed to proceed with minimal interference. So that's the most strict, it's minimal management and interference. The second category is biodiversity conservation area, and that's an area having permanent protection from conversion for the majority of the area, and that is managed for the primary goal of sustaining species or habitats. These areas may include regular interventions to address the needs of particular species or to maintain or restore habitats. So permanent protection for the majority of the area, but with some level of management for habitat and species. And then the third category is natural resource management area. Again, having permanent protection from conversion for the majority of the area, but subject to long-term sustainable land management. So these are areas that may have management practices on them, like sustainable timber harvest. The other 3 definitions in the statute are related to the definitions I just read. So first is conversion, and that is a change from a fundamental change in a natural ecosystem type or habitat natural or undeveloped land cover type or natural form and function of aquatic systems. And so conversion is the change from one land use type or habitat type to another. And so all these categories are looking to have permanent protection from that fundamental change in the habitat or ecosystem type. Next is sustainable land management. And the committee had worked with the Department of Forest Parks and Rec, I believe, to have this definition developed. And so it means the stewardship and use of forests and forest lands, grasslands and wetlands, riparian areas, and other lands, including the types of agricultural land that support biodiversity in a way and at a rate that maintains or restores their biodiversity, productivity, regenerative capacity, vitality, and their potential to infill, now and in the future, relevant ecological, economic, and social functions at local, state, and regional levels, and then that does not degrade ecosystem function. So it is management, but does have a sustainable focus so that there is regeneration and prevention of degradation. And then finally, an important definition is, what does it mean to be conserved? So conserved means permanently protected and meeting the definition of the ecological, the permanently protected and meeting one of the three categories. So ecological reserve area, biodiversity conservation area, and natural resource management area for the first goal, which is the 30 by 30. And for the 50 by 50 goal, conserved primarily means permanently protected and meeting one of those three categories. Although other long-term land protection mechanisms and measures that achieve the goals of Vermont conservation design that are enforceable and accountable may be considered. So for the first part, the 30% by 2030, these three categories are what determine if something is conserved for purposes of the statute. And there's a little bit more flexibility when you get to 50% conserved for the whole state. So those definitions are then used in the rest of the statute. First, 2802 establishes the vision and goals for the state. So the vision of the state of Vermont is to maintain an ecologically functional landscape that sustains biodiversity, maintains landscape connectivity, supports watershed health, promotes climate resilience, supports working farms and forests, provides opportunities for recreation and appreciation of the natural world, and supports a historic settlement pattern of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. It is the goal of the state that 30% of Vermont's total land area shall be conserved by 2030, and 50% of the state's total land area shall be conserved by 2050. The Secretary of Natural Resources shall lead the effort in achieving these goals, and the land conserved shall include state, federal, municipal, and private land. So these are goals. They are aspirational. There's no penalty if they're not reached, but there is a directive to the Secretary of Natural Resources to lead the effort to achieve these goals. And it's important to recognize that the calculation of how much land area has been conserved includes both public lands and private lands. So this law does not seek to acquire all lands to be public lands or owned by the state. It recognizes that also the federal government, municipal government, and private citizens have done work to permanently protect land, and those also count towards this. So if the state is doing work to acquire land and conserve it, but all the other entities that are doing that work too, it counts, and the effort to conserve this land isn't solely the state's effort. It recognizes that other entities are doing this work too. And then finally, there's a typo on here. Somehow I managed in C, reaching 30% by 2030 and 50% of 2050 shall include a mix of the conservation categories. And so it doesn't say specifically how much of each category needs to be conserved, but it does say in order to support an ecologically functional and connected landscape with sustainable production, of natural resources and recreational opportunities, the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the principles of conservation science and the conservation targets within Vermont conservation design, prioritizing ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain and restore old forests. So the ecological reserve area category is the most strict, and there are certain natural communities that are identified in Vermont conservation design as rare or high priority, and those under this statute should have the highest level of protection by virtue of them being rare or irreplaceable.
Yes,
I
Representative.
can't remember, is current use land part of this? Land enrolled in current use?
So, no, current use land is not a permanent protection,
Right.
because you could exit the program at any
Right.
time. So, I think that I think there is information on that in the report, because that has been considered, but the focus of this bill is land that has been permanently consumed.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, just when it says working farms, if a farmer wants to sell their farm, does it have to be sold to someone that's going to work the farm?
Are you referencing in the statute? This bill is not specific to agricultural land.
Because it says supports working farms, forests, and
In the vision,
Oh, in the vision. Okay.
it's a
Okay,
vision for the whole state.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's no
Okay,
specific
sorry.
require, no, yeah, so
I thought it
it's,
was a vision of the, it was.
Yeah.
a preamble or something.
it is kind of like in the preamble, it's more of the like aspirational stuff, so there's
Yeah.
nothing specific requirements on working farms in this.
Gotcha. Thank you.
We did reference it in the work we did on updating statewide land use statutes last. We referenced this vision.
Yep. All right, so as already mentioned, 2803 is the conserved land inventory. So that's the first step. So in order to get to 30%, need to know how much land is already conserved. And so VHCB was directed to work with the Agency of Natural Resources to produce by July 1 of 2024, the conserved land inventory. And so it's an inventory of Vermont's conserved land and the conservation practices, and serving as the basis to meet the goals of Vermont conservation design and the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 goals. So in addition to just having an inventory of what land is already conserved, subsection B included all these additional requirements that needed to be addressed in this report. So the first was a review of the conservation categories and make any recommendations to them to reflect what they saw in their inventory. They also were directed to develop what types of agricultural lands would qualify under this program as supporting and restoring biodiversity and could fall into the natural resource management category. Number two said, what is the actual amount of conserved land that already fits into the categories, including the public and private land? A summary of the totality of conservation practices available currently to reach the goals. An assessment of how state lands will be used to increase conserved ecological reserve areas. So acknowledging that the state already owns a lot of land that is permanently conserved, how much of it does fit into the ecological reserve category. Implementation methods that could be utilized for achieving the goals of this chapter using Vermont conservation design as a guide. A review of how aquatic systems are currently conserved or otherwise protected in the state. And that's because it did come up last year about whether aquatic systems should be a part of this work. And conserving aquatic systems is slightly different than conserving land. Number 7 is how existing programs will be used to meet the conservation goals and recommendations for any new programs that may be needed to help meet the goals, as well as what existing funding sources there are and recommendations for new funding sources. And that will be needed for the acquisition of land, purchase or donation of conservation easements, staffing capacity, long-term stewardship requirements, which are things that are required when you have a permanent conservation easement or a permanent protection of a piece of land. Additionally, they were asked to do an equity assessment of existing land protection and conservation practices, and an evaluation of the opportunities related to intergenerational land transfer trends and how the state could proactively direct resources to achieve conservation at the time of transfer. So a lot of things went into this report. I will say, I did not copy the statute verbatim because it is quite long, but so if you want to read the exact language, I tried to make sure that the highlights from this section were in here, but it's a little bit longer. But those are the 10 things you asked them to do in this report. Next, though, based on that report, 2804 requires that there be the conservation plan developed. So by December 31st of this year, 2025, VHCB shall work with ANR to develop a plan to implement the conservation goals. And so that plan shall include comprehensive strategy for achieving the vision and goals while continuing to conserve and protect Vermont's agricultural land, working forests, historic properties, recreational lands, and surface waters. Implementation methods for achieving the vision and goals using Vermont Conservation Design as a guide. Recommendations to provide and increase equitable access to protected and conserved lands and land-based enterprises, including recreational access to and use of conserved lands. And recommendations to implement the vision and goals while also enhancing Vermont's current investments and commitments to working land enterprises, rural landowners, and broad conservation mission implemented by the Secretary and VHCB, including conservation of agricultural land, working forests, historic properties, recreational lands, and surface waters. They are required to hold at least 12 public meetings between July 1, 2023 and December 31st, 2025 to solicit input from stakeholders. And so in addition, I did not put it on the slide, but the committee did include a fairly long list of which specific stakeholders needed to be consulted as part of this process. I can read it to you if you'd like. So specifically shall include private owners of forest lands and agricultural lands, land trusts, conservation organizations, environmental organizations, working land enterprises, outdoor recreation groups and businesses, indigenous groups, and representatives from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities, watershed groups, municipalities, regional planning commissions, conservation commissions, and the relevant state and federal agencies. And at least 3 of the public meetings need to be designed to solicit comments from the general public. So a lot of the stakeholders specifically included are people who do work in the conservation space generally, and so they probably will have a lot to say, but also hearing from the general public was also required. And then finally, the conserved land inventory shall be updated every other year to track progress towards meeting the goals, and it shall be made publicly available. And the secretary shall submit a report to the relevant committees January 15th following each update. And that's it. You did provide funding to VHCB. You gave them $75,000 for the public outreach for all of the meetings. And then you did also give ANR $150,000 to hire a limited service staff position to assist specifically on this work.
Thank you. Do members have questions?
Do we know how much land we have now that
Yes. So the inventory is in there, and so we can read last
Yeah.
we heard, which we had a public hearing in July of this year to kind of check in on the inventory. It was depending on the final way the definitions came down, we're already at 24 to 27%. And I guess what I should do now is also just share a little of the background. I was one of the lead sponsors of this bill, and it comes from realization, and I accept so E.O. Wilson actually is a famous ecologist who put forward a vision for conserving biodiversity for the whole planet and said, we got to at least conserve half of our resources for the rest of life on the planet, non-human life, that is, in order to sustain it. And so in the work that we did over a number of years, actually, we dug deep into the importance of conservation to Vermont and Vermont conservation design, which we will be getting background on next week from the person at the Agency of Natural Resources who is the current steward of that project. Bob Zano is coming in to share what that really is. But essentially, the statute for the first time draws attention to the importance of conserving lands for biodiversity's sake. And it's not intended in any way to take away from the lands that we already are conserving. And many of those lands were biodiversity focused. But it was to say, like, actually, this is also really important work that we need to be doing. And so the vision of the half Earth, but then when you consider that Vermont is essentially currently it's 74% forested, and then so those would be considered natural lands that are part of this functional landscape, and that additionally there's other lands, open wetland areas, other natural lands that would fit into the categories that are described here in the statute. It made sense to me that Vermont could easily meet multiple goals of the state of Vermont, as well as create this vision for conserving half of the state, which, when you think about it, we're much more accustomed to a Vermont that is way more undeveloped than 50%. So kind of was a good fit for us in terms of our brand and the things that matter to Vermonters. Any other questions or thoughts?
In coming about this 30 by 30, 50 by 50, was there any consideration taken to the economic impact for affordability, housing, stuff like that, what it was going to do in those respects? We know that we're trying to keep younger Vermonters. We heard testimony today about training and trying to keep young people in the state, drawing them to the state. Was there any consideration during this deliberation regarding those aspects?
I would say yes, there's consideration always to the economic impacts of everything we do. And in fact, when you were just asking the question, my mind flashed to a number of years ago, we got a report on the economic payback of open space and open lands. And then I would additionally say that a large part of the program success that we heard about this morning is that passion for outdoor work and the need for that natural landscape to be available. Because if we lose it, and it won't be here, and we won't have a working forest, there won't be timber framing happening with Vermont trees, for example. And then the other thought I had is that the Vermont Land Trust coming in yesterday and mentioning the history of Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which we will hear from, we'll dig into them as well. But Vermont early on committed to essentially what the vision here that we codified has been talked about anecdotally forever, for decades, since Act 250 was passed. And so I think Vermonters have acknowledged that we can develop well and maintain the Vermont that we know and love and enjoy. So I think rather than looking at it in competition, we've said we can have housing and we can have conservation. We just need to plan for both.
My concern is coming from business. If you take something that's available and cut it by 50%, you're going to increase the cost of it. And that, again, the affordability issue. That's one of the reasons for my question. And Representative Pritchard brought up the current use. A lot of people think, they put their land in current use because they want to maintain it in the state that it is. And could that be a vehicle to get us to the 30 by 30 and then 50 by 50? Because there is so much of Vermont that's already in current use, and although there are arguments that it can come out of current use, it is not, it is a hurdle, and it can be a pretty high hurdle. And wouldn't that be enough to satisfy some of the definitions and some of the vision in this?
We took a lot of testimony on the importance of current use and its role in what previous commissioner of Forest Parks and Rec called the conservation ladder. And I guess I would just say that permanent conservation is not for every landowner. And current use is for many landowners the right thing to do right now. So not like none of this is considered, it's all voluntary. So it's people who want to be conserving their lands. Pretty much.
Question, yeah, about, for example, the Vermont Land Trust, which of the three categories does that type of, where it's just the development rights that are being conserved or owned by a third party? What category does that fall into?
So I think it depends on how they structure their easements. And I don't know a ton about the specific work that they do. I think it potentially is any of the three, but I don't know about too much of that. And I would say you should hear from them.
I think it'll be addressed to some extent in the inventory and,
Okay.
but I would say the majority of that land, as the Vermont Land Trust presented yesterday, you know, they do farmland conservation that includes forest land. And one of the places that we are in kind of a dialogue is around, and it's expressed in the statute where we said, we asked the inventory to include a kind of recommendation or review of how would lands conserved for agricultural purposes, how do we figure out which ones support biodiversity? And that's kind of a cutting edge conversation in a lot of ways. So we're sort of in dialogue about it. And I actually haven't read the inventory yet, so I don't know what the recommend is in there yet.
Could we possibly meet the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 with land that would not be considered for housing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think the focus right now in the land use statute updates that we made is on the compact settlement areas and increasing the density there, and the acknowledgement that we actually have a lot of capacity within areas with with infrastructure available. And there's communities that want to invest in creating like new village areas that have water and sewer, for example. And I think it's a both and situation. And that, I mean, I'll say partly because we have been so, Vermont landowners and Vermonters have been so committed to maintaining an open working landscape, we still have that opportunity in Vermont. We kind of all know when we visit other states that some of them have lost that opportunity. They don't have that functional connected landscape that we still have. So time is of the essence.
Yeah, and you may want to hear too about from VHCB how they went about the process, because what this first report was gathering all the information about what lands are already conserved, what types of lands they are, and putting them into the categories. And so that's where you get to the between 24% and 27% are already of the state have already been conserved before anything under this bill has moved forward. And so they then are looking at, all right, what are some recommendations to get to that next 6-ish% of the state in the next 5 years? What types of programs or funding would be needed in order to achieve what is a goal, not a mandate?
A follow on to Chris's question about current use, in addition to the land that is conserved in one of these three categories, and counts toward the 30%, in addition to that, how much is in current use?
2 million acres is in current.
In current use.
Some of it's already
And what
conserved.
percentage does that translate to?
Well, some of it's already conserved. The
Yeah,
state
that's
is 6 million acres roughly, so the whole state's 6 million.
Okay.
And I'm sure it's in there. Because
It probably is. I haven't, yeah.
Well, sounds like,
there, because
sounds like that might get us pretty close, or if it's over the 30%, then if we can count. Yeah, okay.
what, go ahead. Larry.
Yeah, I'm just getting back to the thoughts about the potential for tension for between housing and permanently conserving land. I really think that is extremely minimal. I've seen models for my own small town of Randolph for how we could increase housing just in that very tiny space, which is already developed. And there's actually a lot of room for increased development and for increased housing. And these are the areas that we would want housing anyway, where we already have water and sewer, where it's the cheapest to build and so on. And so when we're talking about lands which would be, permanently conserved in the future, they would tend to be, interior forest blocks, places that are hard to get to, these large areas which are actually very expensive to develop, and the density within which you could develop would be very low. So we really wouldn't be looking at the potential for adding a lot of housing in these types of areas, which we would most want to conserve. The places where we would really most readily increase our housing supply are in these places which we already have development and some potential future areas, like Chair Sheldon was mentioning, where we might incorporate some new areas around some village centers. But again, those are very, very small percent areas as a percentage of the state. So I don't really perceive any real conflict between having housing and having these sorts of permanently protected natural areas. I think they really complement each other in quite wonderful ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Ellen, was any thought given to land that is already in current use, managed by foresters? Some of us, myself included, are going to have to come up with a whole new forestry plan by April of 25. So I've already engaged foresters to do that. So my question is, that's expensive to do. If you want to permanently conserve, I'm hearing it. If it's in current use, it's not considered conserved because it's not permanent. In order for me to be permanent, is the state thinking about forgiving the cost to exit current use and swapping over to conserved permanent?
This whole program is voluntary,
Mhm.
so,
They're both voluntary.
I'm not sure I follow what you're saying, swapping out.
You don't
Well,
have to exit current use to become permanently conserved.
You don't have to,
That's what I just,
but that, yeah,
I think, if I may, I think what Representative Labor was saying, to remain in current use, you have to maintain a forestry plan.
yeah.
Right.
And that forestry plan means you have to incur costs.
Oh, yeah.
That's what he was talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. You may remember, I'm not sure if you were here, but we did change some requirements. Or we created a category of current use for a certain type of land that would allow non-management, which presumably would be a lighter plan. But, yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I mean, I think we should talk about those things at some point. All right. Thank you, Ellen. All right, members, with that, we are.
If I may, one more
Yeah.
question.
Sure. Representative Sacker.
Representative Sacker. Representative before everybody said sorry. In hearing your explanation, am I to understand that you foresee most of the development or the living area in the state of Vermont with regard to the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 to include only areas where people reside, where there's water and sewer available? There would be no development or housing where people would be on their own, maybe like spring wells are very popular in Vermont, or drilled wells.
No, I'm sure there'll be considerable development outside the already developed areas. But even if we conserve permanently 50% of the state, we still have, 3 million acres within which to do those sorts of things. I think it leaves us plenty of space for folks who want to live where they are digging their own wells and things like that.
All right.
Things that make you go,
Representative Arnold.
Are we going to hear from the Army Corps of Engineers?
Sure, on what, on,
Just because
Clean
like
Water
Water
Act,
now
or-
Day and they were like putting in hundreds of moorings or hundreds of moorings are going in that bay.
uh-huh,
That's like cutting it in half in terms of its past use. And the people who do that is the Army Corps of Engineers. And I mean, I feel like I wonder if they could just fill the bay up with, or the lake up with moorings. You know, and there's no one to, we can't regulate.
we could, under the headings of our water discussions, or I think that you could probably reach out to them also, but yeah, we could talk about that.
Okay.
Representative Bartholomew.
I just want to chime in that I was really supportive of this because it really, the bill attempts to address a lot of our concerns and initiatives as a state. One being, as was discussed, smart development as opposed to unrestrained growth. Another being maintaining unbroken tracts of land for wildlife corridors. And another huge one is dealing with our energy issues and our climate goals and requirements coming from transportation. One of the things we focused on a lot is the huge amount of fossil fuels that is used for transportation. And when we continue to spread people all across the state and avoid these village centers, we're never going to, you can't develop mass transit systems that work if people are spread all over the place. So you're really trying to, it meets a lot of the goals we have as a state. So that's why I thought this was a great bill when we passed it, and just wanted to chime in with that observation.
I was just gonna ask, and I know it's been a little while, but, what are other states doing? Like, what's the trend that you're seeing in these kinds of bills and creating objectives? I know, and I think, as we've said, Vermont's in a better place to make such goals because we have so much forested and working landscape compared to many other states. But yeah, I'm just curious if there's trends. Where are we out the front? Is there part of the movement?
So I'm not the best person to answer this question, but what I can tell you is that President Biden did issue an executive order along these lines, reflecting the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 goal, and that was years ago. I think we were the first state to codify it, but other states were looking at it. That's all I have, but I do think
Neighbor states have.
New York was looking at it when we did the bill, which was a couple of years ago now. California beat us, but they did an executive order. They didn't codify it. And really it was, from where I sat, the importance of the intent of E.O. Wilson's, and I have the book if anyone wants to borrow it. It's called Half Earth. Is the biodiversity focus of it. But I just want to tag on a little to what Representative Bartholomew said and say that additional things that we've already started to hear about in committee are the significant benefits of intact functional forests to protecting our developed areas and the downstream areas, and mitigating the impacts of the flooding on the human communities, which is why this bill is called, it's called community resilience. It's human and natural community resilience, not just one or the other. So there are multiple benefits to the intact functioning landscape, which we are going to get to learn more about. Right. Thank you, Ellen.
thank you.
That you will adjourn for the day, and we will see you back tomorrow morning after the floor. We have something on the agenda for 10:30. So